Welcome to Moonlight Mate's Library. Let's step into a tale of ultimate redemption and immortal devotion. The iron gates slammed shut, condemning Brenna to the freezing blizzard. Discarded, worthless. 9 years of marriage erased in an instant, simply because her womb remained empty. She curled into the deep snow, waiting for the bitter cold to finally stop her broken heart. Then, the earth violently trembled. Garrick, the immortal Alpha, a towering, blood-soaked warlord who made kings weep, halted his massive warhorse in the courtyard. He dismounted, his terrifying shadow completely swallowing her fragile, shivering frame. "Please," she sobbed, shrinking away into the ice. "Nobody wants a barren mate." The ruthless conqueror did not draw his heavy sword. Instead, the most dangerous man alive dropped to his knees in the freezing mud. A shockingly tender smile softened his scarred face. "I have enough soldiers," he whispered, wrapping his massive, warm wolf-pelt cloak around her shaking shoulders. "I only ever wanted you." The heavy oak door slammed shut with a definitive, hollow thud. The sound echoed through the frozen courtyard, sealing her fate. "Take your cursed empty womb elsewhere," her former husband's voice carried through the thick wood. Brenna stood barefoot in the snow. She clutched a thin, frayed shawl against her chest. 9 years of marriage had ended in a span of 5 minutes. 9 years of silent prayers, bitter tears, and empty cradles. In the unforgiving Northern Territories, a wife who could not bear sons was worse than useless. She was a burden. She was an omen of starvation and weak blood. The village women had already turned their faces away. Wooden shutters slammed shut one by one down the narrow mud street. No one would take in a barren woman. It was a harsh age, and mouths were too expensive to feed just for charity. The winter wind howled, biting through her thin linen dress. Brenna did not weep. She had cried all her tears years ago in the dark. She walked slowly toward the outer walls of the keep. Her bare feet left small, bloody prints in the fresh snow. The cold was a slow poison. First it burned her toes and fingers. Then it settled deep into her bones, numbing the pain. She found a small alcove near the southern watchtower. The stone was freezing, but it blocked the worst of the wind. Brenna sank to the ground, pulling her knees to her chest. She closed her eyes. She wondered if freezing to death felt like falling asleep. She hoped it did. She thought about her life. She had scrubbed floors, baked bread, and managed a household flawlessly. Yet, because her body refused to swell with child, none of it mattered. Her worth was entirely tied to a function she could not perform. She felt broken. She felt like a defective tool, rightfully discarded by its owner. The numbness reached her chest. Her breath grew shallow, forming pale clouds in the freezing air. Then, the ground began to tremble. It started as a low rumble. It vibrated against her spine through the stone wall. A horn blew in the distance, a long, mournful blast that cut through the howling wind. The heavy iron portcullis of the main gate shrieked as it was raised. The sound of dozens of armored destriers pounded against the frozen earth. Brenna opened her eyes just enough to see through her frost-caked lashes. A column of mounted men rode into the courtyard. They wore thick furs over heavy chainmail. At their head rode a man who seemed entirely too large for a normal horse. It was Garrick, the warlord of the Iron Marches. Men whispered his name in taverns across the continent. They called him the Immortal. They called him the Alpha of the North. He was a man who had survived a dozen fatal wounds, returning from every campaign covered in the blood of his enemies. He ruled with absolute, terrifying authority. Garrick halted his massive black stallion in the center of the courtyard. The horse snorted, stamping a heavy hoof into the snow. Brenna tried to shrink further into the shadows. The last thing she wanted was the attention of the warlord's men. But Garrick's head turned. His sharp, dark eyes scanned the perimeter. They locked onto the small alcove. He did not shout orders. He simply raised one armored hand. The entire column of riders stopped instantly. The silence in the courtyard became absolute, broken only by the wind. Garrick dismounted. The heavy thud of his boots against the snow sounded like a death knell. He walked directly toward her. Brenna trembled, terrified that she was trespassing on his stone. He stopped towering over her. His broad shoulders completely blocked out the gray winter sky. Brenna kept her eyes on the snow, waiting for a brutal kick or a harsh command to leave. Instead, she heard the heavy rustle of fur and leather. Garrick unfastened the massive wolf-quilt cloak from his own shoulders. He knelt in the snow. The warlord did not care about the mud or the ice. He reached out and draped the heavy, incredibly warm fur over her shaking body. Brenna grasped. The scent of wood smoke, old leather, and a distinctly masculine warmth enveloped her. Before she could speak, his large, calloused hands slid beneath her knees and behind her back. He lifted her with effortless strength. She weighed absolutely nothing to him. "My lord," Brenna whispered, her voice cracking. "Save your breath," Garrick said. His voice was deep, a low rumble that vibrated through his chest against her cheek. He carried her past his stunned soldiers. He carried her past the whispering servants. He did not hand her off to a maid. He brought her directly into the great hall, up the heavy stone stairs, and into his private chambers. A massive hearth fire roared in the center of the room. He laid her gently on a large bed, covered in thick furs. The heat of the room hit Brenna violently. The sudden shift in temperature made her body ache, and the reality of her situation came crashing down. She was in the warlord's bed, a man who could have any young, fertile, beautiful woman in the kingdom. Panic seized her throat. The old conditioning, the years of verbal abuse from her former husband, flared up in her mind. She tried to push herself up, clutching the heavy fur to her chest. Her hands were shaking violently. "You don't understand," she stammered, her voice thick with tears. "You should throw me back out. They threw me out." Garrick stood at the edge of the bed. He was pulling off his heavy leather gauntlets. He paused. "Why would they do that?" he asked quietly. Brenna broke. The shame of a decade spilled out of her in a jagged, painful sob. "Because I am broken!" she cried out. The tears ran hot and fast down her pale cheeks. She looked away from him, unable to bear the disgust she knew would be in his eyes. "Nobody wants a barren mate," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "I can give you nothing. I have no value." The room was silent for a long moment. There was only the crackle of the burning logs. She waited for his heavy footsteps to move away. She waited for the door to open and the guards to drag her out. Instead, the mattress shifted. Garrick sat on the edge of the bed beside her. He reached out. His large hand gently caught her chin, forcing her to look at him. There was no pity in his dark eyes. There was no disgust. The feared warlord, the immortal alpha who made kings tremble, just looked at her with a quiet, fierce possessiveness. He smiled. It was a small, purely genuine expression that softened the harsh lines of his scarred face. "I have enough soldiers, Brenna," he said softly. "I only ever wanted you." Brenna stared at him. She thought her ears were playing a cruel trick. Warlords did not speak like this. Men did not look at useless women with such reverence. "You are mocking me," she whispered. She pulled the fur tighter around her neck. Garrick did not laugh. His jaw tightened, a muscle feathering beneath his scarred cheek. "I have never mocked you," he said. "I have spent 10 years looking for you." Brenna frowned. Her mind was foggy and slow from the cold. 10 years ago, she was just a farmer's new bride. She was a nobody in a forgotten village. "You do not remember," Garrick stated. It was not a question. He stood up and walked to a heavy iron-bound chest near the fireplace. He opened it. He did not pull out gold, silver, or battle trophies. He walked back to the bed holding a small, faded piece of coarse blue linen. Brenna's breath caught in her throat. She knew that cheap fabric. It was a piece of her old winter cloak, the one she had lost during her first year of marriage. Her former husband had beaten her mercilessly for losing it. She had told him it simply blew away in the winter wind. "The old mill at the edge of the Blackwood," Garrick said quietly. The memory hit Brenna like a physical blow to the chest. She had been walking back from the river. A terrible thunderstorm had broken out, turning the roads to deep mud. She had taken shelter in the abandoned mill. but she was not alone inside. A man was huddled in the darkest corner of the ruin. He was covered in mud and deep, bleeding slash wounds. He looked like a cornered wild animal. He was holding a broken broadsword, ready to fight to his last breath. Brenna had been terrified, but she had also seen the agonizing pain in his dark eyes. She did not run away. She did not scream for the local guards to collect a bounty. Instead, she tore the hem of her only winter cloak. She knelt in the dirt beside a highly dangerous stranger. She bound his deepest wounds with her clumsy hands. She left here her only piece of bread and her full water skin. "You were freezing," Garrick said, his voice dropping to a low, rough rumble. "But you wrapped your own cloak around my shoulders before you left." Brenna looked at his massive, powerful frame. It was impossible to connect this warlord to that dying man in the dirt. "They were hunting me," Garrick continued. "I was a dead man. I had already accepted the dart." He reached out. He gently traced the line of her jaw with his calloused thumb. "Then a girl with kind eyes gave me her food and her warmth. You gave me a reason to stand back up." Brenna leaned into his touch instinctively. His hand was rough but incredibly gentle against her bruised skin. "I was just a girl," she whispered. "I did what anyone would do for a bleeding man." "No," Garrick said firmly. "Anyone else would have sold me to the king's men for a silver coin." He placed the scrap of blue linen in her palm. He gently closed her cold fingers around it. "I fought my way out of that forest. I built a mercenary army. I conquered this entire territory." He looked deep into her eyes. "I did it all to build a keep safe enough for you." A loud knock sounded at the heavy oak door. It broke the intimate silence in the room. "Enter," Garrick commanded. His voice instantly shifted back to the cold authority of a military commander. The door opened. 3 servants hurried into the large room. They carried silver trays piled high with roasted meats, hot bread, and steaming broth. They kept their eyes glued to the floorboards. They were clearly terrified of their master. Garrick stood up. He pointed a massive finger at the lead servant. "Look at her," he ordered. The command cracked like a whip in the quiet room. The servants immediately raised their heads. They looked at Brenna, who was instinctively shrinking back into the furs. "This is Lady Brenna," Garrick announced. "She is the absolute master of this keep." The servants immediately dropped to their knees. They bowed their heads entirely to the cold stone floor. "Her word is my word," Garrick continued, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "If she asks for a fire, you burn down the forest. If she is hungry, you empty my storehouses." He stepped closer to the kneeling servants. The sheer physical size of him was deeply intimidating. "If anyone speaks to her with disrespect or mentions her past, I will remove their tongue. Do you understand?" "Yes, my lord," the servants chanted in unison. They were actively trembling. "Leave the food and get out," he dismissed them with a wave of his hand. They quickly set the heavy trays on a wooden table near the bed. They scrambled out of the room, closing the door softly. Garrick brought a bowl of rich, fragrant broth to the bed. He sat down beside her again. Brenna stared at the food. Her stomach cramped violently. She hadn't eaten a full meal in 3 days. Her former husband had often withheld food as punishment. He constantly claimed a barren woman did not deserve full winter rations. She reached for the heavy bowl, her hands still shaking slightly from the cold and the shock. Garrick moved the bowl slightly out of her reach. Brenna flinched, expecting a harsh reprimand. Instead, he picked up the silver spoon himself. He blew on the hot liquid gently to cool it. "Your hands are still too cold to hold the metal," he said softly. "Let me." He brought the spoon to her cracked lips. Brenna parted them hesitantly. The rich, savory broth coated her dry throat. It was the most delicious thing she had tasted in a decade. A single tear slipped down her cheek, dropping onto the dark fur blanket. "I am not used to this," she admitted quietly. "I am used to being entirely invisible." Garrick fed her another spoonful. His eyes never left her pale face. "You will never be invisible again," he promised in a low tone. He set the half-empty bowl aside. He reached for a piece of soft, warm bread and tore it in half. "My men are fiercely loyal," he said, handing her the bread, "but they will need to see you tomorrow." Brenna looked down at her dirty, broken fingernails. "They will see a cast-off wife, an old, useless woman." Garrick growled. The sound was deep and dangerous. It vibrated in the quiet space between them. "They will see my savior," he corrected her sharply. They will see the only woman I have ever bowed to. He leaned forward. He rested his forehead gently against hers. Rest now, Brenna. You are safe here. Brenna ate the bread slowly. She tasted the rich butter and the fine salt. In her old home, she was only allowed the burnt, stale crusts. The good flour was always saved for her husband. "Why didn't you come for me sooner?" she asked. The question slipped out before she could bite her tongue. Garrick looked down at his scarred hands. For a brief moment, the fearsome warlord looked deeply ashamed. "I did not know your name for many years," he admitted, "and it took a long time to secure these violent borders." He looked back up. His dark eyes were fierce and unyielding again. "When I finally learned who you were, my spies told me you were married. I thought you were safe. I thought you were happy." He clenched his jaw. "I stayed away out of respect for your marriage. It was the hardest thing I have ever done." Brenna realized then the immense depth of his restraint. He was a man who took whatever he wanted by absolute force. Entire cities fell to his armies, yet he had stayed away from a simple farmer's wife just to protect her domestic peace. "I was never happy," Brenna whispered into the quiet room. "I know that now," Garrick said. His voice turned extremely dark, laced with a very dangerous promise. "My scouts brought me word this morning of what he did to you, of how he threw you out in the freezing snow to die." He stood up. The relaxed, gentle posture was instantly gone. He looked exactly like the immortal Alpha again. "Where are you going?" Brenna asked, a sudden spike of fear hitting her chest. Garrick stopped at the door. He looked over his massive shoulder. The firelight caught the harsh, violent angles of his face. "I have a veteran army camped in the courtyard," he said evenly. "And there's a man in your village who needs to learn a severe lesson about throwing my things away." Brenna pulled the thick furs up to her chin. She did not ask him to stop. For the first time in her adult life, she felt entirely, fiercely protected. The winter storm had intensified by the time Garrick reached the village. 50 heavy cavalrymen rode behind him in absolute, disciplined silence. The rhythmic, deafening thud of armored hooves shook the frozen mud of the narrow streets. The villagers cowered behind their locked doors, peering terrified through the cracks in their wooden shutters. They all knew the banner of the Black Wolf. It meant sovereign retribution had arrived at their doorsteps. Garrick did not stop at the village square. He rode directly to the largest and most prosperous house in the settlement. It was a sturdy farmhouse, built with thick stone and heavy oak beams. It was a home Brenna had maintained with flawless, exhausted dedication for 9 agonizing years. Garrick did not dismount immediately. He simply sat on his massive stallion, staring at the heavy front door. His lieutenant, a towering man clad entirely in dark iron, stepped forward without a word and kicked the wooden barrier. The reinforced door splintered instantly. It crashed inward with a violent, deafening crack. Ewan, Brenna's former husband, was dragged out into the freezing snow mere seconds later. He was a broad-shouldered man who had grown soft and arrogant on the comforts of his wife's relentless labor now. He was thrown roughly into the mud at the hooves of Garrick's imposing warhorse. Ewan scrambled backward. His face was pale with sudden, blinding terror. He looked up at the towering warlord, completely failing to understand why the immortal Alpha was at his threshold. "My lord," Ewan stammered. He raised his hands in a pathetic, trembling display of submission. "I have paid my taxes. I have given my finest grain to your garrisons. I am a loyal subject." Garrick remained entirely still in his saddle. The dark shadows of the twilight seemed to cling to his heavy fur cloak. He looked down at the farmer with a gaze as cold and unfathomable as the abyssal depths. "You threw a woman out of your house this morning," Garrick's voice rumbled over the howling wind. Ewan blinked in supreme confusion. The raw fear in his chest was briefly replaced by genuine bewilderment. "The Barren one?" Ewan asked. He clearly thought this must be some bizarre administrative misunderstanding. He actually scoffed, a nervous, ugly sound escaping his throat. "My lord, she was utterly useless to me." The temperature in the courtyard seemed to plummet sharply. The armored knights behind Garrick shifted. Their heavy gauntlets rested menacingly on the pommels of their broadswords. "She was a defective thing," Ewan continued, desperately trying to justify his cruelty to the silent warlord. "A man needs an heir to work this land. I merely discarded a broken vessel to make room for a real woman. Garrick finally dismounted. The slow, deliberate movement was utterly terrifying to watch. He walked toward Ewan. Depacked snow crunched violently beneath his iron-tipped boots. Garrick did not draw a weapon. He did not need steel to break a mortal man. He grabbed Ewan by the collar of his thick-wooled tunic and hoisted him completely off the ground with one arm. Ewan choked violently. His heavy boots dangled uselessly in the freezing air. "You speepy vessels and airs," Garrick whispered. The low frequency of his voice vibrated with pure, malevolent intent. "You speak a human value as if you possess the intellect to understand the weight of the world." Garrick leaned closer. His scarred, battle-hardened face was a mask of cold, predatory wrath. "The woman you cast into the snow is the sole reason I draw breath. She is the sovereign heart of the Iron Marches." Ewan's eyes bulged in their sockets. The blood drained entirely from his face as the sheer magnitude of his mistake finally registered. "No," Ewan choked out in disbelief. "That cannot be true. She is just Brenna." "She is Lady Brenna," Garrick corrected him softly, his grip tightening like a steel vice. "And you have deeply insulted my mate." Garrick did not strike him. A swift, bloody death would be an unearned mercy for a creature like this. Instead, he opened his hand and dropped Ewan back into the snow. The farmer collapsed, gasping greedily for air. "Strip him," Garrick commanded without looking back. Two heavily armored guards stepped forward immediately. They showed zero hesitation or pity. They tore the warm wool tunic, the thick trousers, and the heavy leather boots from Ewan's trembling body. They left him in nothing but thin, ragged undergarments. It was exactly the state he had forced upon Brenna. "My lord, please!" Ewan screamed as the biting winter wind hit his bare skin. "I will freeze to death out here." Garrick turned away. He walked back to his massive black stallion and mounted the saddle smoothly. "This land belongs to her now," Garrick declared. He projected his voice so every terrified villager hiding in the shadows could hear perfectly. "This house, these fields, and every grain of wheat stored within. It is all the absolute property of Lady Brenna." Garrick looked down at the shivering, pathetic man weeping in the snow. "You are banished from the Iron Marches. If my patrols find you within these borders by sunrise, you will be hunted down like a feral dog." Ewan sobbed loudly. He wrapped his bare, freezing arms around his chest. "I have nowhere to go. I have absolutely nothing." "You have exactly what you gave her," Garrick replied coldly. "A winter storm and a locked door." The warlord pulled the leather reins of his horse. The massive beast pivoted with flawless military precision. "Burn the roof of the house," Garrick ordered his lieutenant to him. "Leave the stone walls intact. No one will ever lay here again." Within minutes, bright orange flames licked at the dark winter sky. The intense heat of the burning thatch pushed back the falling snow. Ewan wailed in profound despair. He was forced to watch the physical manifestation of his pride and arrogance turn entirely to ash. Every villager who slammed a shutter in Brenna's face now prayed to forgotten gods that the warlord did not know their names. Garrick did not look back at the ruin. He spurred his horse forward, leading his heavy cavalry out of the village. The retribution was absolute and swift. He had erased the source of Brenna's pain with effortless, terrifying authority. Yet, the ride back to the fortress felt agonizingly slow. Garrick felt an unfamiliar, heavy anxiety gnawing at his chest. He had spent 10 brutal years waging war. He knew perfectly well how to break sieges and shatter enemy lines, but he had no idea how to feel a gentle heart that had been systematically crushed for nearly a decade. He remembered the terrifying frailty of her body when he had lifted her from the icy ground. She was so light. She felt like a fragile bird with broken, weary wings. He urged his stallion into a heavy, punishing gallop. He desperately needed to get back to the keep. He needed to ensure she was still breathing. He needed to see the warm firelight reflecting in her quiet, sorrowful eyes. The immortal Alpha, a man who feared no mortal arm on earth, was suddenly terrified of a drafty room. The massive stone walls of his keep finally loomed through the thick blizzard. The watchtowers were fully illuminated. The torches cast a warm, golden glow against the falling, relentless snow. Garrick felt a strange, intensely tight sensation in his chest as he looked up at the high, arched window of his private chambers. It was the first time in his brutal, endless life that he was actually returning home. Garrick left his massive stallion with the night stableman. He walked toward the main keep in silence. The violent storm still raged outside. but the stone walls of his fortress offered absolute shelter. He stopped in the long, torch-lit corridor outside his private chambers. He did not touch the heavy iron door handle. Instead, Garrick unbuckled his thick leather sword belt. He leaned his heavy broadsword against the stone wall. He unfastened the cold steel clasps of his chainmail. He let this heavy armor slide off his broad shoulders, handing it to a silent guard. He did not want the harsh clinking of iron to disturb the quiet room. Garrick pushed the oak door open with agonizing care. The heavy hinges made almost no sound. The large hearth fire had burned down to a pile of deep, glowing embers. The room was incredibly warm. Brenna was completely buried beneath the thick black wolf furs. Only the pale crine of her hair was visible on the soft pillows. Garrick walked quietly across the wooden floorboards. He pulled a heavy, high-backed chair close to the edge of the bed. He sat down in the dim light. He simply watched the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of her shoulders. For 10 years, his mind had been filled with nothing but troop movements, supply lines, and the bloody geography of war. Now, sitting in the quiet dark, the only territory that mattered was the small space she occupied on his mattress. Hours slowly slipped by. The deep black of the winter night eventually gave way to the pale slate-gray light of dawn. The change in light hit Brenna's face. She shifted under the heavy furs. Suddenly, a violent gasp tore through her throat. Her eyes snapped open, wide and filled with sheer, blinding panic. She bolted upright, clutching the furs to her chest, her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "The fire!" Brenna gasped out, her voice thin and completely terrified. "I let the hearth die! The bread is not needed!" The decade of trauma was hardwired into her bones. Dawn meant relentless labor, and oversleeping meant a portal unforgiving punishment from Ewan. She swung her bare legs desperately over the edge of the tall bed. She did not even register where she actually was. "I have to fetch the water," she muttered rapidly to herself. Her hands shook as she searched blindly for her thin linen dress. A large, incredibly warm hand gently grasped her trembling shoulder. Brenna flinched violently. She instinctively raised her arms to protect her face from a heavy blow. Garrick froze. Seeing her cower from his touch caused a sharp, physical pain in his chest. "Brenna." His voice was a low, steady rumble. It was the careful tone a man used to calm a terrified, cornered doe. Brenna opened her eyes slowly. The sight of the massive, scarred warlord sitting beside her brought reality crashing back. She looked at the rich tapestries on the walls. She felt the incredible softness of the furs beneath her hands. The memory of the previous night washed over her, the snow, the cold alcove, and his impossibly warm cloak. "My lord," she whispered. She immediately tried to slide off the bed and onto the wooden floor to bow. Garrick did not let her drop. His large hands held her firmly, keeping her seated safely on the thick mattress. "You are not for anything," Garrick said quietly. "The sun is barely awake." Brenna shook her head. The ingrained fear was too deep to simply disappear in a single night. "You do not understand," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I am a barren woman. I have no other use." She looked down at her work-roughened hands. "If I cannot give a man sons, I must earn my shelter with my back. I can scrub the scullery floors. I can wash the soldiers' tunics." Garrett clenched his jaw. He felt a fresh wave of absolute, murderous hatred toward the man he had left freezing in the snow. Ewan had not just broken her heart. He had entirely dismantled her humanity. Garrick stood up from the wooden chair. His massive frame blocked out the pale morning light from the arched window. He walked over to a heavy, iron-bound chest near his writing desk. He opened a small wooden lockbox inside. He returned to the bed holding a heavy iron ring. Dozens of large, old-fashioned brass and iron keys hung from it. He knelt on the floorboards directly in front of her. He brought himself down so she did not have to look up at him. Garrick gently took the cold, trembling hands. He placed the heavy ring of keys directly into her small palms. Brenna stared down at the heavy metal. She did not understand what was happening. "This is the key to the southern granary," Garrick said, touching a large, square-headed iron key. "This brass one opens the main treasury vault. That small silver one unlocks my private correspondence chest. He looked up into her pale, terrified face. His dark eyes were entirely sincere. There are 300 servants in this keep, Brenna. There are women paid well to wash the floors and bake the bread. He closed her small fingers around the heavy iron ring. His large hands enveloped hers completely. You are not a servant. You are not a beast of burden meant to earn your keep with bruised knees. Brenna's breath hitched. A solitary tear spilled over her eyelashes and ran down her cheek. But I cannot give you an heir, she sobbed softly. The deepest, most agonizing shame of her life finally spoken into the daylight. I am an empty vessel. The village women said I was cursed. Garrick reached up. He wiped the warm tear from her cheek with his rough thumb. The village women are fools who measure their worth by the swelling of their bellies, he said firmly. He leaned closer. He needed her to hear the absolute truth in his voice. I am a man who has waded through rivers of blood. I have seen the darkest, most wretched parts of the human soul. His gaze dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second, before meeting her eyes again. When I lay dying in that mud 10 years ago, I did not need an heir. I did not need a son to carry my banner. He rested his forehead gently against hers. The physical contact grounded her frantic heartbeat. I needed mercy. I needed light. And you gave me both. Garrick pulled back slightly. He looked at the keys resting securely in her hands. I do not want a vessel, Brenna. I want a partner. I want the woman who saved my life to share my peace. Brenna looked down at the heavy keys. They represented unimaginable wealth, power, and absolute security. And this fearsome, legendary warlord had just placed them all willingly into the hands of a discarded, broken wife. The thick, suffocating wall of shame that had wrapped around her heart for a decade finally began to crack. 2 older women entered the chamber shortly after Garrick stepped out to attend his morning council. They did not carry mops or buckets. They carried large wooden basins of steaming, scented water and armfuls of rich fabric. They introduced themselves quietly as the head seamstress and the senior maid. They kept their eyes lowered, showing profound respect. Brenna was unaccustomed to being served. She instinctively tried to take the heavy water basin from them, but they gently refused. They bathed her with warm water and soft sponges. They brushed the tangles from her pale, graying hair with a carved bone comb. Then they brought forth the dress. It was made of thick, heavy crimson wool, lined at the collar and cuffs with dark fox fur. It was not the flimsy, revealing silk of a young mistress. It was the substantial, commanding garment of a ruling lady. Brenna stood before a tall, polished bronze mirror. She barely recognized the reflection staring back at her. She saw the fine lines around her eyes and the exhaustion pale on her cheeks. But the deep crimson color brought a sudden warmth to her skin. She no longer looked like a starving beggar. She looked like a woman of enduring consequence. Yet a heavy knot of dread tightened in her stomach. Clothes could hide her bruised ribs, but they could not rewrite her history. She was about to face a hall full of hardened veterans and noble commanders. They would surely know she was a Barren cast-off. The heavy oak door opened. Garrick stepped into the room, dressed in a formal black tunic bearing the silver wolf crest. He stopped completely. His dark eyes swept over her from the hem of the heavy wool to the crown of her braided hair. He did not offer flowery compliments. He simply exhaled a long, heavy breath, as if a great weight had been lifted from his chest. You look exactly as you should, Garrick said softly. He walked toward her and offered his right arm. The thick leather of his bracer felt solid and immovable. Brenna hesitated. Her hands were suddenly clammy with cold sweat. They will whisper, my lord, she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. They will wonder why the immortal Alpha brought a useless farmer's wife to his high table. Garrick gently took her hand. He placed it securely in the crook of his arm, trapping it against his warm side. My men do not whisper, he stated flatly. And if any visiting lord dares to, he will leave this keep without his jaw. He led her out of the bedchamber and down the wide stone corridor. The sounds of the great hall drifted up the main staircase. It was a chaotic mix of deep voices, clanking armor, and heavy wooden mugs hitting oak tables. As they reached the top of the grand stairs, Brenna's breathing grew shallow. She wanted to shrink behind his massive frame. Garrick did not let her hide. He slowed his pace, forcing her to walk proudly beside him, step for step. They descended the stairs. A sharp-eyed guard near the entrance noticed them and struck his halberd violently against the stone floor. The sharp, ringing crack echoed through the massive hall. Instantly, the chaotic noise ceased. The silence that fell over the room was absolute and intensely intimidating. 300 battle-hardened men turned their heads. They looked up at the staircase. Brenna felt the immense weight of their collective stare. She gripped Garrick's arm tightly, fighting the urge to run. Garrick walked her down the remaining steps. They crossed the open floor toward the raised dais and the heavy wooden high table. No one sat down. Every man in the hall remained standing at rigid attention as their warlord passed. Garrick pulled back the heavy wooden chair at the center of the table. He gestured for Brenna to sit first. It was a profound breach of feudal tradition. The lord always seated himself before his court. Brenna sat down slowly. The fur-lined chair was incredibly comfortable, but she felt entirely exposed. Garrick remained standing. He looked out over the sea of scarred faces and battered armor. 10 years ago, Garrick's deep voice carried easily to the very back of the massive stone hall. I returned to the northern camps from the Blackwood. I had lost my horse, my sword, and nearly all my blood. The older veterans in the room nodded slowly. They remembered that dark, terrible night perfectly. I was kept alive by a torn piece of blue linen, Garrick continued, and by the mercy of a stranger who owed me nothing. He placed his heavy hand gently on Brenna's shoulder. The protective gesture was impossible to misinterpret. This is Lady Brenna. She is the stranger from the Blackwood. She is the reason this army has a commander. A man stepped out from the front row of long tables. He was heavily scarred with graying hair and a thick iron breastplate. Brenna recognized the insignia on his shoulder. He was a senior captain of the heavy cavalry. The captain walked to the base of the raised dais. He looked directly into Brenna's eyes. There was no judgment in his weathered face. There was only deep, profound gravity. I remember that night, my lady. The captain spoke, his voice rough from years of shouting orders. We thought he was a corpse walking. We thought our rebellion was over. The captain slowly drew his heavy broadsword from its leather scabbard. Brenna flinched slightly, but Garrick's hand tightened reassuringly on her shoulder. The captain did not raise the blade in aggression. He reversed his grip. Holding the heavy steel by the blade, he offered the hilt toward Brenna, and then he dropped heavily to one knee on the hard stone floor. My sword is yours, Lady Brenna, the captain swore. My shield is your wall. My life is your toll. It was the ancient oath of absolute fealty. It was a vow usually reserved only for kings. Before Brenna could process the magnitude of the gesture, a loud metallic clatter echoed through the hall. Every single man in the room shoved their ward benches backward. 300 swords were drawn in perfect, terrifying synchronization. 300 battle-hardened warriors dropped to one knee, their heads bowed in absolute, unhesitating submission. Your wall! Your toll! The collective shout shook the dust from the heavy wooden rafters. Brenna stared out at the kneeling army. The air in her lungs felt incredibly thin. She had spent 9 years believing she was a burden to a single, unremarkable farmer. Now, the most feared military force on the continent was kneeling at her feet, offering their lives in exchange for her comfort. She looked up at Garrick. The warlord was looking down at her, a fierce, proud satisfaction burning in his dark eyes. He had not just given her a safe roof. He had given her an impenetrable fortress of living steel. The great hall eventually settled into a low, respectful murmur. Brenna sat beside the warlord for the remainder of the evening meal. She did not have to serve anyone. Every time she reached for her silver goblet, a silent attendant was instantly there to refill it with warmed, spiced wine. It was a staggering shift in reality. 9 years of grueling, unappreciated servitude had vanished in a single day. Yet, as the hours passed, a heavy, familiar anxiety began to creep back into her chest. She looked at Garrick's strong profile in the firelight. He was a sovereign ruler, a conqueror in the prime of his power. Such men built empires, and empires always required a bloodline to sustain them. When the meal finally concluded, Garrick offered his arm again. He did not lead her back to the main bedchamber. Instead, he guided her toward a narrow, spiraling stone staircase at the back of the keep. The air grew significantly cooler as they climbed higher into the ancient structure. "Where are we going?" Brenna asked softly. Her hand rested lightly on his solid forearm. "To the apex," Garrick replied. His boots made no sound on the worn stone steps. He opened a heavy, iron-bound door at the very top of the tower. Brenna stepped into a large, circular room. It was starkly different from the rest of the martial fortress. The walls were lined with massive, thick glass windows that had cost a fortune to import from the southern coasts. A large iron brazier burned brightly in the center, keeping the glass from frosting over. Beyond the windows, the entire northern territory stretched out beneath the moonlight. The snow-covered forests and frozen rivers looked like a sea of pale silver. "This is my private sanctuary," Garrick said quietly. He closed the heavy door behind them, shutting out the rest of the world entirely. No guards are permitted up here. No counselors. No servants. He walked over to the thick glass and looked out over his massive domain. Brenna stood near the brazier. The warmth of the coals fought the chill radiating from the high altitude. She looked at his broad back. The anxiety in her chest finally swelled into a sharp, unavoidable pain. "It is beautiful," Brenna whispered, "but it requires a legacy, my lord." Garrick turned his head slightly. He did not speak immediately. "You have conquered a kingdom," she continued, her voice trembling but determined. "You will need a son to hold it when you are gone." She swallowed hard against the tight lump in her throat. Ewan was a simple farmer, and even his small patch of dirt drove him mad for an heir. Brenna took a hesitant step forward. The rich, crimson fabric of her dress felt suddenly heavy and suffocating. "I cannot give you that legacy, Garrick. I am a barren field." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. She hated saying them, but she refused to build a life on an illusion. "When you finally realize you need a son, my empty womb will become a burden again. I cannot survive being discarded a second time." The room fell into a heavy, agonizing silence. The only sound was the howling wind battering the thick glass windows. Garrick turned away from the window completely. He walked slowly toward her. He did not look angry. He looked profoundly tired of the world's endless, cruel rules. He stopped a few feet from her. Then, he reached up and unfastened the silver clasps of his black tunic. Brenna watched in slight confusion as he pulled the heavy garment over his head and tossed it aside. He wore no linen undershirt. His bare chest and abdomen were fully exposed to the firelight. Brenna gasped softly. She brought her hand to her mouth. Garrick's torso was a canvas of horrific, brutal violence. There were thick, jagged scars from broadswords across his ribs. There were deep, puckered starbursts from arrow wounds on his shoulders. A massive, terrifying burn scar stretched across the left side of his abdomen, a permanent reminder of a siege gone wrong. He was not a pristine, untouchable god of war. He was a man who had been torn apart and stitched back together a dozen times. "Look at me, Brenna," Garrick commanded softly. She forced her eyes away from the terrible wounds and looked up into his face. "Do you see a perfect vessel?" he asked, his voice a low, rough rumble. "Do you see a man who meets the world's standard of wholeness?" Brenna shook her head slowly. Her heart ached for the agony he must have endured. "The world expects men to be flawless protectors and women to be fruitful mothers," Garrick said bitterly. He stepped closer. The heat radiating from his large, scarred body washed over her. "It is a lie created by people who have never had to fight for their next breath in the mud." He gently took her hands. He guided her right palm flat against his chest, directly over his beating heart. Beneath her fingers, she felt the rough, raised tissue of a particularly deep stab wound. "My bloodline ends with me," Garrick stated with absolute, unwavering certainty. Brenna's eyes widened. "But your kingdom?" "My kingdom will pass to my most capable generals when I die," he interrupted smoothly. "I did not conquer the North to build a dynasty. I conquered it to survive. And I survived to find you." He moved closer, completely closing the distance between them. "I am a ruin of a man, Brenna. My soul is stained with the blood of thousands." His large hand moved up to cradle the back of her head. His fingers tangled gently in her braided hair. I do not need a woman to give me children. I need a woman whose spirit is strong enough to anchor my dark one. A fresh wave of tears spilled over Brenna's lashes. They were not tears of shame this time. You healed my deepest wound 10 years ago, Garrick whispered, leaning his forehead against hers. You gave me mercy when I deserved the abyss. That is the only legacy I will ever want. Brenna finally let go. The decade of built-up tension, self-loathing, and profound fear shattered completely. She wrapped her arms tightly around his broad, scarred waist. She pressed her face into his warm chest. She did not care about the jagged scars. To her, they were the marks of a man who had fought through hell to bring her home. Garrick wrapped his massive arms around her, crushing her gently against him. He buried his face in her pale hair, breathing in the scent of her skin. High above the frozen earth, shielded by thick glass and ancient stone, they held each other. Two discarded, dirken pieces of the world had finally found the one person who saw them as entirely whole. The harsh northern winter did not relent. It buried the world under relentless layers of ice and desolate silence. Inside the impenetrable stone bastion, Brenna's physical wounds slowly faded. The dark bruises turned to pale shadows and eventually disappeared beneath her skin. Yet, she did not spend her days resting idly by the roaring hearths. The heavy iron keys at her belt were not mere ornaments. They were a profound, sovereign responsibility. Word had reached the inner courtyard that the outer settlements were suffering terribly. The widows and orphans of fallen soldiers were rationing their meager supplies. The winter storms had cut off the southern trade routes entirely. The north was a brutal, unforgiving realm. Usually the vulnerable were left to endure the bitter cold alone, sacrificed for the survival of the strong. Brenna knew the agonizing pain of an empty stomach in the freezing dark. She refused to let it happen within the shadow of her new home. She descended into the vast, cavernous cellars beneath the main keep. Two heavily armed guards walked silently behind her. She approached the massive oak doors of the southern granary. A stout, hardened quartermaster named Thorn stood watch. Thorn was a veteran of many bloody sieges. He respected Garrick with absolute devotion. However, he viewed this new, quiet woman with thinly veiled, traditional skepticism. "My lady," Thorn said, offering a stiff, obligatory bow. "The lower cellars are freezing. It is no place for a woman of your delicate station." Brenna did not retreat from his subtly condescending tone. She unhooked the large, square-headed iron key from her leather belt. "Open the doors, Quartermaster Thorn," Brenna commanded quietly. "We are releasing a third of the salted meat and winter wheat to the outer settlements immediately." Thorn stiffened. His thick, graying eyebrows pulled together in a deep, disapproving frown. "With utmost respect, Lady Brenna," Thorn replied, his voice gruff and unyielding. "Those are military reserves." He crossed his thick arms over his iron breastplate. "We do not feed useless mouths when a siege could easily come in the spring." It was the exact logic Ewan had used to justify his cruelty. It was the ancient, merciless law of the Iron Marches. Before Brenna could formulate an answer, the temperature in the stone corridor seemed to drop sharply. Garrick stepped out from the deep shadows of the intersector hallway. He had been inspecting the lower armory, but the sound of resistance drew him instantly to her side. The warlord did not draw a weapon. His mere presence was a suffocating physical weight in the narrow corridor. Thorn immediately dropped to one knee. The blood completely left his weathered face. He knew he had just risked immediate execution by defying the warlord's mate. Garrick looked at the kneeling quartermaster. His dark eyes promised absolute, immediate violence. He opened his mouth, fully prepared to order the man's tongue removed for his insolence. But Brenna raised her hand. It was a subtle, incredibly calm gesture. Garrick paused. He looked down at her. He saw the cold iron resolve solidifying in her pale eyes. He realized she did not need him to be her executioner in this moment. The warlord stepped back. Crossing his massive arms over his broad chest, he yielded the floor entirely to her authority. Brenna looked down at the kneeling veteran. Her voice did not tremble in the slightest. "Look at me, Thorn," she ordered. Her tone was no longer that of a frightened, cast-off wife. It was the voice of a sovereign lady who had earned her place through fire and suffering. The quartermaster slowly raised his head, his eyes wide with sudden apprehension. "You speak of useless mouths," Brenna said coldly. "You speak of the widows who sent their husbands to bleed out in the mud from this fortress." She stepped closer. The heavy cruisin wool of her dress brushed against the freezing stone floor. "You speak of the children whose fathers died to buy that steel breastplate on your chest." Thorne swallowed hard. He could not maintain eye contact with her. The absolute moral weight of her words crushed his rigid, heartless military logic. "An army that starves its own widows is a horde of cowards, not conquerors," Brenna stated flawlessly. "Lord Garrick built an empire of iron and strength. I will not let it rust from the inside with cowardice and cruelty." She held out the heavy iron key, forcing it into his line of sight. "Open the doors, distribute the grain. And if I hear that a single orphan has gone without fire or bread tonight, you will answer directly to my judgment." Thorne took the key with trembling hands. "Yes, my lady. Immediately, my lady." The quartermaster scrambled to his feet. He unlocked the massive oak doors with frantic, desperate speed. Brenna stood perfectly still as the heavy doors swung inward, revealing mountains of life-saving provisions. She felt a profound tectonic shift within her own soul. She was no longer just a survivor hiding behind a warlord's cloak. She had become the shield for those who could not fight. Garrick walked up behind her. He placed his warm, calloused hand gently against the small of her back. "You spared his life," Garrick murmured. His deep voice rumbled with undeniable, fierce pride. "He is a capable soldier, Garrick. He simply forgot why he was holding a sword," Brenna replied softly. The warlord leaned down. He pressed a long, reverent kiss against the crown of her silver-streaked hair. "They will call you the Mother of the North," Garrick said quietly into the cold air. He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her firmly against his side. "You will feed 1,000 starving children, Brenna, and every single one of them will owe their future to you." The words sank deep into her heart. They effortlessly filled the desolate, agonizing void that had haunted her for a decade. She did not need a child of her own blood to possess a lasting legacy. She had an entire kingdom to nurture, and beside her stood the most dangerous man in the world, fiercely guarding her absolute right to do so. The deep winter brought isolation, but it could not entirely sever the ancient political ties of the North. 4 powerful provincial barons arrived at the keep a month before the spring thaw. They brought heavy wagons of tribute, an imposing escort of armored knights, and deeply entrenched archaic traditions. They also brought Lady Isolde, the youngest daughter of Lord Vance. She was a woman bred specifically for political alliances. She was young, fiercely beautiful, and draped in expensive southern silks that defied the bitter cold. The barons had heard the rumors of Garrick's new companion. They had dismissed the news entirely. To them, a barren, low-born farmer's wife was nothing more than a passing winter distraction for a weary warlord. They expected Garrick to set Brenna aside the moment a genuine, fertile noblewoman was offered. A formal audience was convened in the great hall. The atmosphere was incredibly tense, heavy with the smoke of burning pine and unspoken threats. Garrick sat upon his high, carved wooden seat. Brenna sat perfectly still beside him, wearing her heavy crimson wool. Lord Vance stepped forward. He completely ignored Brenna's presence, fixing his gaze solely on the immortal Alpha. "My Lord Garrick," Vance began, his voice echoing off the high stone arches. "We bring loyalty, tribute, and the promise of a lasting dynasty." He gestured broadly to Lady Isolde, who offered a flawless, calculated curtsy. "My daughter is of pristine lineage. She is robust, young, and entirely capable of securing your legacy with strong sons." Vance offered a dismissive, sidelong glance toward Brenna. "It is time to cast aside temporary charity cases, my lord. A sovereign ruler requires a proper vessel to build an empire." A collective, sudden intake of breath swept through the ranks of Garrick's veterans lining the walls. The quartermaster, Thorne, subtly rested his hand on the hilt of his broadsword. The sheer audacity of the Baron was practically a death sentence. Brenna felt a momentary chill brush against her spine. The old, familiar words of being a useless vessel echoed in the vast room. But she did not look down. She did not clutch her skirts in terror. She looked at the young, arrogant noblewoman. Then, she looked at the heavily armed men standing silently to her left and right. These were the men she had fed. These were the soldiers who had sworn their lives to her toll. She felt Garrick shift slightly in the massive wooden chair beside her. He did not roar. He did not draw the heavy steel resting against his thigh. Garrick simply leaned forward. He rested his scarred hands on the armrests of his chair. His silence stretched out, agonizing and suffocating, until Lord Vance began to sweat beneath his thick furs. "You speak of lineage in my hall," Garrick finally whispered. The low frequency at his voice was profoundly terrifying. "You bring a child wrapped in silk into a fortress built on mountains of bone, and you demand I alter my providence." Garrick stood up slowly. The physical size of the warlord seemed to consume all the light in the massive room. Lord Vance took a rapid, involuntary step backward. Lady Isolde's calculated confidence completely vanished. "My empire is already built," Garrick stated coldly. "It was paid for in blood, and it is governed entirely by my will." He stepped down from the dais. His heavy boots struck the stone floor like a tolling bell. "The woman sitting upon that chair is not a charity case. She is my mate. She is the absolute, undisputed sovereign of this territory." Garrick stopped a few feet from the trembling Barren. His dark eyes were devoid of any mortal mercy. "If I wanted an heir, I would have taken a dozen noble daughters 10 years ago. I want Brenna." He pointed a massive armored finger at the heavy wooden doors of the hall. "Take your tribute. Take your daughter, and remove yourselves from my sight before I decide your bloodline ends today." Lord Vance opened his mouth to apologize, his face pale with sudden, consuming panic. "Wait!" A clear, unwavering voice cut through the heavy tension. Garrick paused immediately. He turned his head and looked back at the dais. Brenna stood up. The heavy crimson fabric pooled elegantly around her feet. She walked down the short stone steps. She moved with a quiet, undeniable grace that no amount of southern silk could replicate. She stopped beside Garrick. She did not look at the terrified young woman. She looked directly into the eyes of the arrogant Baron. "The winter has been deeply cruel to the outer settlements, Lord Vance," Brenna said evenly. "You have brought heavy wagons of grain and salted pork to purchase a crown for your daughter." Brenna held up her hand, silencing any protest the Baron might have attempted. "You will leave the wagons in our courtyard. You will surrender 30% of your spring trade profits to the central treasury." Lord Vance stared at her in absolute shock. "My lady, that is an extortionate tax. It will cripple our estates." "It is the price of your insolence," Brenna corrected him softly. "And the cost of feeding the orphans you completely ignored on your journey here." She stepped closer to the defeated nobleman. Her gaze was as cold and sharp as northern ice. "You may leave with your lives, but before you walk out of those doors, you will acknowledge who holds the keys to this kingdom." Brenna stood perfectly straight, an unyielding pillar of hard-won authority. "Kneel," she commanded. Lord Vance hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then he saw Garrick's hand drop casually toward the hilt of his broadsword. The proud, ancient Baron collapsed to his knees on the cold stone floor. His heavily armored knights followed instantly. Lady Isolde sank to the ground, her expensive silks dragging in the dust. They bowed their heads, entirely subjugated by a woman they had deemed useless just moments before. Brenna looked down at the kneeling nobility. She felt no cruel triumph, only a profound, quiet peace. The abyss that had swallowed her youth was finally closed. She had forged her own absolute value in the fires of survival. Garrick stood silently at her shoulder. He looked at the kneeling lords, and then down at the fierce, beautiful woman beside him. The immortal Alpha smiled. He knew beyond any shadow of a doubt that he had chosen the perfect queen. Spring arrived in the iron marches slowly. The great thaw began with a series of deep, booming makes that echoed across the frozen rivers. The heavy winter snow finally melted away, revealing dark, solid earth underneath. For the first time in 10 years, the northern spring did not smell of ash and marching armies. It smelled of damp pine and fresh soil. Brenna stood on the high battlements of the main outer wall. She did not wear the heavy winter furs today. She wore a lighter gown of deep blue, the exact shade of the cloak she had torn a decade ago. The heavy iron keys still hung securely at her leather belt. They were a permanent fixture now. She looked down at the sprawling courtyard and the open iron gates beyond. The outer settlements had survived the brutal, unforgiving winter. No child had frozen in the dark, no widow had starved alone in her bed. The grain and salted meat she had seized from the arrogant southern barons had kept the entire territory alive. A long procession of people was moving slowly up the main dirt road toward the fortress. They were not an army, and they brought no steel weapons. They were the common people of the north. They were farmers, blacksmiths, weavers, and orphans. They carried woven wool baskets filled with the very first snowdrops and pale winter roses. They had walked for miles through the mud simply to stand before the open gates of the warlord's keep. Garrick stepped out onto the stone battlements behind her. He walked silently, his heavy leather boots making a familiar, deeply comforting sound on the stone. He stood beside her, resting his large forearms on the thick stone parapet. He looked down at the gathering crowd. The people did not cower in terror at the sight of the immortal Alpha. Instead, they looked up at the wall with profound, absolute reverence. An older woman stepped forward from the front of the crowd. She held the hand of a small, thin boy in a patched wool tunic. Brynjolf recognized the boy immediately. He was one of the orphans who had received daily bread from her lower kitchens. The boy looked up at the high stone wall. He raised a small, clumsy bundle of white snowdrops. "For the Mother of the North," the boy's clear, piping voice carried easily on the spring wind. The crowd echoed the sentiment instantly. A low, rumbling chorus of genuine gratitude rolled across the valley. Bryna felt a sudden, sharp ache in her chest. It was not pain. It was an overwhelming, blinding sense of fulfillment that stole the breath from her lungs. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but she did not let them fall this time. She raised her hand, returning the salute of the people who now belonged entirely to her care. "You see," Garrick murmured. His deep voice vibrated warmly near her ear. "You called yourself a barren field, Bryna." He turned his head to look at her profile. His dark eyes were filled with an ancient, deeply settled peace. "Look at what you have grown from the ice. Look at the harvest you have single-handedly saved." Bryna took a deep, trembling breath of the crisp air. For 9 years, she had firmly believed her body was a cursed, empty tomb. She had allowed a cruel, small-minded farmer to convince her that she possessed no inherent human value. But as she looked down at the hundreds of faces gazing up at her with fierce loyalty, the final chains of her past shattered. A mother did not merely give birth. A mother protected, nurtured, and fiercely defended the fragile life within her domain. She had no children of her own blood, yet she had 1,000 sons and daughters in the north. She turned away from the stone wall and looked directly at Garrick. The fearsome warlord, the man who had effortlessly brought kings to their knees, was looking at her with absolute adoration. He had built a massive empire of steel and violence, but she had given it a beating heart. Bryna reached out. She rested her hand flat against his scarred chest, right over his steady heartbeat. "They told me a woman without a son would leave no mark on this earth," she murmured. Garrick shook his head slowly. He covered her hand with his massive, calloused palm. "Your mark is carved into the very bedrock of this territory," he answered firmly. "Centuries from now, they will not sing songs of my military conquests. They will sing of your mercy." He stepped closer, completely blocking the cold spring wind from her shoulders. "Ewan threw away a quiet wife," Garrick said. The old, murderous anger was completely gone, replaced by the calm of absolute victory. He did not realize he was tossing the key to the entire north into the snow. Bryna smiled. It was a genuine, radiant expression that erased the heavy years of suffering from her face entirely. "I was so terrified you would eventually want someone else," she confessed quietly into the open air. Garrick wrapped his thick, powerful arms around her waist. He pulled her flush against his solid, immovable frame. He rested his forehead against hers, closing his eyes against the bright morning sun. "I spent my entire life walking through blood, mud, and endless death," he whispered roughly. "I do not want another woman. I do not want a dynasty. I do not want anything the world tells me I should have." He opened his eyes. They burned with a fierce, eternal promise that anchored her soul completely. "I said it the night I found you freezing in the shadows, and I will say it until my last breath leaves my lungs." He leaned down, pressing his lips against hers in a slow, deeply reverent kiss. "I only ever wanted you." The wind carried his words over the high stone walls and down into the waking valley. Below them, the people of the Iron Marches cheered wildly for their sovereign lady. Bryna closed her eyes and leaned fully into the warmth of her eternal mate. The long, bitter winter was finally over. The immortal Alpha had found his peace, and the discarded wife had found her undisputed throne. In the end, a woman's true worth is never measured by an empty womb, but by the boundless mercy of her heart. Bryna's gentle strength brought the immortal Alpha to his knees, proving that even the coldest Iron Kingdom can be melted by absolute devotion. If this journey of heartbreak and fierce protection touched your soul, please hit that like button. Your support is the magic that keeps Moonlight Mates Library growing. Subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss next week's Tearjerker, a story about a scarred, rejected outcast who accidentally saves a dangerously possessive Lycan king. You won't want to miss a single second. Which moment was your favorite today? Was it Garrick wrapping his heavy cloak around Brenna in the blizzard, or our queen forcing the arrogant southern barons to kneel? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, stay fierce, stay loved, and I'll see you in the next chapter.